prospects of the Texas Tech 2022 recruiting class, but that didn't last long. We're going to discuss the combo guards, just absolutely dominant performance as of late, and why you should be excited about him coming in the next season. Coming up on today's Locked On Texas Tech.
Are Locked On Texas Tech, your daily podcast on the Texas Tech Red Raiders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Texas Tech, a member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Be sure that you are subscribed to the Locked On Texas Tech YouTube channel if you have not already, and leave a like on this video. I'm Ryan Mainville, he's Emery Lida, and today we are talking about Lamar Washington as our second freshman preview for the upcoming Texas Tech basketball season. And I've got to say, this is one that I am really excited about because, man, as this kind of cycle has played out, I was hesitant about Lamar Washington. I'll admit it that he is not a guy I was very high on coming into this offseason, not for anything or any particular reason per se. I just, I'd seen the film and thought, okay, it looks like a lot of like prep school lead guard play. I'm not exactly sure how it will transfer, but I feel like I'm already eating my words, and I didn't even have an official stance on him. I feel like it's time for me to buy all the available Lamar Washington stock. I'm so excited to talk about this guy today.
Yeah, I feel like I was kind of high on him initially, but even since then, since he committed to Tech, the last few months, he's just continued to look better and better. And I mean, we've seen on film, we've seen the stats have looked really good. He's a guy that's played now on the high-level prep circuit with Arizona Compass Prep this season. And obviously, when he committed to Tech, it was still kind of unknown how he would do with that in terms of just because it's a pretty big jump up in competition. Obviously, he played in Geico Nationals, played a variety of different prep schools over the course of the season. And I mean, you look at what Washington brings to the table, and he was always seen as a versatile guard, always seen as someone who's going to have the defensive intensity, could be a potential 3-level scorer. But man, the last couple of months, and particularly in the last month, seeing what he did at Hoop Summit, seeing what he did, in my opinion, in the game against Montverde and Geico Nationals, those were the two games for me that really sort of flipped my viewpoint on him even further, because I've always been someone that kind of felt like Lamar Washington had the sort of archetype that would be someone that could play from the get-go just because of his defensive intensity and ability to score effectively from a variety of different ways. But just seeing what he was able to do in those two games against elite level competition where he looked really good. And that's just something that I feel like you look at what his recruiting stats or his recruiting status looked like a few months ago and being a sub 120 player. I mean, for him to stand out like that against that level of competition really should have a lot of Tech fans excited.
Yeah, and before we really get into any of the ratings or even his stats or style of play, I want to talk about his actual recruitment for a second here because I feel like it's worth it. Chase Camplin did a really, really good Q&A with Lamar Washington a couple of days ago over at Red Raider Sports. Highly so you go check that out. But it was almost like a sigh of relief for me to hear Lamar Washington talk about how excited he was for Texas Tech, the relationships that he's built with the staff, the fact that he'll be on campus May 29th, so right around the corner, less than 2 weeks away now. It was a breath of fresh air for me, and the reason being, Barrett Peary had an absolutely massive role in recruiting Lamar Washington. And, whenever I saw this Q&A, I commented on Red Raider Sports oh, this is like super good to read and super relieving to read, even knowing that Peary has gone to UNLV. And I got some pushback for that, but I think it's a testament to two things. I think it's fair to say that there's no Texas Tech Lamar Washington relationship if not for Barrett Peary. I mean, this was a guy that Barrett Peary had been recruiting since he was in the 8th grade. This is a guy that was very well known on the Oregon, just high school roots level. He was the Oregon Player of the Year in 2021. He and Peary developed a really strong relationship while Peary was at Portland State. You go back and you read anything from the beginning of his recruitment at Texas Tech, and there's nothing but positivity towards the relationship with Barrett Peary. But with that considered, I feel like it's only applause and only a massive win for the Texas Tech staff as it stands today to be able to retain this guy. Because while I do think that I'm not super out of bounds to say there's no relationship forged without the Barrett Peary introduction, there's no relationship that sticks if this staff doesn't work hard to invest in him and continue to recruit him like they value him, which they really should, because he's a really good player. And so, man, I think it's worth kind of looking around and being grateful that he's still around, even with Barrett Peary gone. And then just looking at the Texas Tech bench and looking at old man Mark Adams and just being like, holy cow, man, this guy can really recruit. He can really, really do this.
Yeah, so two things. First off, I think it can't be understated the amount of, or sort of the benefit that Tech was able to get by being early on Lamar Washington. I mean, this is a guy, obviously a two-sport athlete at Jefferson before he came over and played at Arizona Campus Prep and really focused on the basketball side of things. But he was, by all accounts, sort of a sub 200 recruit nationally up until kind of the middle of September last year. I mean, if you look at his 247 account, he wasn't even in the rankings until late 2021, which is very rare for a 2022 prospect that ends up being a mid to high 4-star. So for Tech to be in early on him and for Peary to have that relationship was really important. But then, like you mentioned, I mean, Mark Adams and staff really sort of continuing to pour their effort into him all the way throughout is really important. I'm glad to see that Lamar Washington has sort of reciprocated that effort towards Tech and has that level of excitement, because it really is something where, like, you didn't really know what was going to happen, just because whenever an assistant coach leaves for another place, and especially someone that had that big of an impact, is kind of it makes you wonder what the next step is going to be for the player that was recruited by them. And obviously with Lamar Washington as well, it's a guy that's picked up interest over the last few months just because of his stock continuing to rise. So on that hand, it's really good to see Tech sort of continuing to pursue him. And also another thing that must be mentioned is with him coming into the program in less than 2 weeks, you're going to have the opportunity for a full summer worth of training and conditioning. Obviously, you're going to have fall practices and whatnot. You're going to have a lot of opportunity to see Lamar Washington grow as a player. And I mean, I'm excited because the growth he made from his junior year to his senior year and the growth that he's made in the last few months has been sensational. And I mean, when Lamar Washington committed, there was a lot to like on tape, and obviously Tech saw that as well, and obviously reached out and offered him, and eventually got the commitment. But for him to show out like he did towards the latter end of his high school career and his prep career, I mean, you have to be looking at this dude suddenly and being like, from year one, he can make an impact with you if you can push the right buttons and get him developed in the right ways. And that's kind of a rare thing to say about someone that came into the year maybe a little bit unheralded. I mean, like I mentioned, he was a guy that didn't have his profile on 247. He wasn't a top 100 recruit until very recently. But I mean, it's hard to argue that Tech or anyone in the Big 12 really has anyone that has risen as much as of late in the recruiting rankings and in terms of national stock as Lamar Washington. I mean, you're seeing him kind of emerge a little bit on the fringes of NBA discussion. Like some of the guys in NBA circle are starting to pick up on the Lamar Washington hype. And so for him to have that level of interest, it's really exciting. And it's really exciting to have him coming into the program pretty soon.
Yeah, my thing is like, honestly, like, just looking at his timeline, Texas Tech really wasn't early on him. I mean, they really didn't jump the gun. I mean, he had that Barrett Peary offer in July of 2020, and then Texas Tech offered about a year later. His first collegiate offer was from Kansas. I mean, this is a guy who has been flying under the radar quite a bit, and that's for sure. But he's a guy that has caught some eyes, and so I think massive testament to the Texas Tech coaching staff, and also like for Barrett Peary to walk in the door from Portland State and say, hey, I've got this guy, um, Oregon Gatorade Player of the Year. He's going to be playing prep ball this year. Good player. We should continue to recruit him and try and get him to be a Red Raider. And the Texas Tech staff to really lean into that, man. The dividends on that are going to be paying next year when he is on campus. Want to talk a little bit about his Nike Hoop Summit performance, because that is what essentially just skyrocketed him in the rankings. But first, a quick word from Built Bar. Summer is coming, and with summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on family vacations. Throw them in your bags and your kids' backpack. Make sure that everyone has a bar so you are fueled for your summer adventures. The best part about Built Bars, they're healthy and delicious. No more sacrificing delicious food for health. With Built Bar, you can have both. And it's easy. All you have to do is go to built.com and order now. Built has a ton of good flavors like banana cream pie, raspberry, double chocolate, and so many more. They are all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. So go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Thanks again for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now be sure to go check out the Locked On NBA Big Board. Host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter is joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Lee Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look into the NBA draft, mock draft, player rankings, and of course, big boards. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Well, one guy that genuinely may have raised his draft outlook as a prospect with his performance in the Nike Hoop Summit was Lamar Washington. And so a quick bit of background for those of you that aren't familiar with the Nike Hoop Summit, which is perfectly okay. There are so many like circuits and events at the elite high school level that I don't blame you for being dizzy at this rate. But the Nike Hoop Summit is where some of the best talent in the country, the best high school talent in the country, comes together and they play each other. And so they usually have a USA team and then a world team, and those two teams will play against each other. Now, that event takes place in Portland, in the Portland Trailblazers Arena. Shout out to Emory. But you need some teams to help both the USA and the world team ramp up before they play each other. And in that case, it was luckily the Portland Generals who have Lamar Washington playing for them. And so Lamar Washington did not play against the world team the day before he played against Team USA. But when he played against Team USA, he made the most of every single minute he was on the floor. He ended the game with 22 points, shot 8 of 15 from the field, 3 of 8 from deep, 3 of 4 from the line, had 5 boards, 2 assists, and 3 turnovers. I mean, we're talking about a game where guys like Khalil Ware, Cam Whitmore, Dariq Whitehead, Johan Troer, Keontae George, Dylan Mitchell. I mean, there's a ton of talent that was on the floor for this game. And you ask pretty much anybody in the building that watched that scrimmage who the best player was, and a lot of people are going to tell you it was either Dariq Whitehead, who's going to be a starter at Duke next year, or it was Lamar Washington. And that is very good company to be in.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it straight up. Like, Lamar Washington was the reason, or one of the main reasons why that Portland Generals team stood a shot in that game. And I mean, you look at the way that they tallied up the quarter system, and obviously they reset after each quarter. It was a kind of a bizarre scoring system, but obviously it was a scrimmage with very little like relevancy. But I mean, Lamar Washington kept that team in the game. And you look at his stats, and obviously, if you're looking at it purely from a statistical standpoint, you could make a good argument that Lamar Washington had the best game of anyone. I mean, the only other guy that I feel like really came close was Keontae George, who had 20 points in that one for Team USA. But when you look at from that standpoint, obviously it looks really good for Washington. But then you hear the firsthand accounts of people that were in the building, and for me, that's what carried a lot of extra weight, because I saw the box score, and obviously you hear about kind of little tidbits of the game, and you're like, okay, like he had a really good game. But just hearing the way that people described how he played and just how elite he was at all three levels, was able to get his own shot, really did a lot of self-creation, and defensively showed a lot of intensity against really good guards. I mean, you're talking about guys that have been household names for years now, whether it be Keontae George or Nick Smith, for example, two guys that are going to be probably coming into next year's potential lottery picks at a minimum. And you've got kind of what you've got what Washington was able to do on the record, and that's just something like you don't hear about that from guys on select teams very often. Even if their teams almost win the game, or even if they have a nice statistical game, it's almost always more about the Team USA guys. They're the guys the guys on the roster that are kind of getting tuned up for the world team or for the USA team. But for him to have that level of an impact where scouts and people within the arena were talking about just how good of a game he had, that shows something. And you piece it together with some of the other stuff that he showed kind of towards the back end of his time at Arizona Campus Prep. And like, this is a guy that the last 3 or 4 months, I mentioned in the first segment, but he has had more of a stock rise than pretty much anyone else in the country. And he's done it against high level competition. And like, I mean, I had personally never heard of the Portland Generals until this happened. Like, before we heard about the scrimmage, and looking at the rest of the roster and kind of what was mentioned, it looked like they only had one other real high major college recruit that was on the roster. So this should not have been a game that Lamar Washington was able to show out that much. But for him to do what he did at Hoop Summit and have kind of the overall support from other people and kind of just them appreciating his game, I think it really adds a lot of confidence. And it made me feel a lot better about him just hearing kind of the firsthand recounts of that game.
And I think the thing that's really exciting about it is the overwhelming consensus and just opinion that he looked like an NBA player. And so, I mean, he's 6'4". He's a big dude. He's like 205, maybe 210. He's got an NBA body, but you just like to be able to play against some of these guys that are on Team USA, some of the best athletes at the high school level in the world, and he played his game. Like, his game is 3-level scoring with an ability to create for teammates, and that's exactly what he did against some of the best competition in the world. And so he got to the rim a lot. There's this one clip of him on Twitter where he essentially takes a screen and then makes a three-pointer like 4 feet off an NBA range three, which is just ridiculous. Just name search Lamar Washington on Twitter if you want to find that. It is absolutely gorgeous. But I mean, he played his game. And when you can play your game against some of the most talented players in the country, that's really, really good news. And I don't think it's a mistake that this game in particular was a big reason why his stock has risen and why he's become a 4-star player. And man, I tell you, there's a lot of guys, and there's a lot of NBA guys that were at this scrimmage, a lot of NBA GMs, a lot of NBA scouts. Lamar Washington's name left on a lot of people's clipboards that I don't think they had coming in. And just looking at next year's class, obviously we're far out right now, but he very well could end up being the most tangible NBA prospect if his game comes around the way that I think it could. I have gone really from being skeptical of Lamar Washington to getting my hands on pretty much any and every piece of tape that I can. And now I think he's at a point where he could legitimately play himself into an NBA prospect.
Well, there might be someone that's committing to Tech pretty soon that I feel like would have a little bit of a jump on the best NBA prospect coming into next year. But aside from that, I mean, Lamar Washington, his rise has been meteoric. He has all of the tangible measurements that you would want to see from an NBA prospect. I mean, he's 6'4", 6'5". He's got a solid jump shot on film, and that's one of the things that I've kind of come around on. I think that the shot is going to be translatable off the ball, and that was something I was a little bit concerned about. Certainly, he's got the strength to play high major hoops from day one, really. Like we mentioned yesterday on the Pop Isaacs preview, that we felt like that might be something he has to adjust to a little bit, and that he's not quite going to be able to bully guys from the get-go in college basketball. I think that Lamar Washington has the strength to, at a minimum, hold his own on the inside and get to the rim and effectively use his strength. I mean, I've seen it on tape or he's going against high-level guards. I mean, specifically looking at guys that he played against Montverde that have that strength, and he's just able to simply like bully them out of the way. So like he's got that sort of strength on his drives to have that impact. And I mean, I think that it's going to be interesting to see how his game translates to Tech, because obviously with any high school prospect, there's a lot that has to be sort of translated over. I mean, we saw it with Lamar Burnett, for example, with with the jump shot just not translating whatsoever. And obviously we saw his defense on the other hand really translating. So like there's unexpected twists and turns, but certainly, I mean, Lamar Washington, I look at what he's done over the last few months, and I can't think of him as anything other than a fringe NBA prospect where you could look at it after a couple of months and just say that he's suddenly firmly in the NBA rotation. It's kind of similar to what we saw with Zaire Smith in a way. I mean, obviously Zaire, I think, came from even further back as a prospect before he came to Tech, but one of those things where it wouldn't surprise me if he had a Zaire type of leap over the course of the year, where by the end of the year, he's looked at as potentially a guy that could be close to the lottery. And I know that that's obviously a bit of a stretch just to say from May of 2022 until May of 2023 how that ends up. But certainly, I mean, it would not shock me if 7 months from now we're looking at Lamar Washington as A, the best draft prospect on Texas Tech, and B, a critical part of the rotation and their success for next year.
That Lamar Burnett comp is really interesting. I want to talk about why. But first, I'd love to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. You save time and money when you use Rock Auto. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourself customers for over 20 years. Rock Auto's prices are reliably low for every customer, so go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, locked on in there. How did you hear about us box so they know we sent you? Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. All right, Emery. Well, going back to that Lamar Burnett comp, as I was working out before we recorded this episode today, I was just trying to think like who are some of the guys that feel really hard to pick up on, but I think for me, as I was looking at guys that have been in the Texas Tech recruiting fold over the past years, Namari Burnett is certainly a name that kind of came to mind. Maybe it's just his experience from the prep route and the circuits, but I think with Namari Burnett, they have sort of similar play styles. I think from a shooting standpoint, Lamar Washington is a lot more solidified. With Namari, he was making shots at the high school level, but I think there were always questions about the fundamentals of his shot. And then I think that Lamar Washington is a little bit of a better creator, but I feel like the translation for Lamar Washington should be a lot more seamless at the Big 12 level. I could be wrong, and that's just my opinion, but I think Lamar Washington has the body. He has the strength to play at the Big 12 level near the hoop. He's got the shot to be able to make shots off of screens. He's got the pull-up ability to make shots at all three levels. I'm really, really high on this guy being a high rotation piece coming into next year, and I've got a little to say in a couple of minutes because it's kind of spicy. But man, I know the guard rotation is loaded next year, but it's impossible for me to think about Lamar Washington being out of it right now.
All right, so you raised Namari Burnett. I think that's a good example, but I think in some ways I'm trying not to be too revisionist, but I honestly look at what Lamar Washington has coming into college, and I think that you can make an argument that at least offensively, he has so much more solidified. Like you mentioned, like the jump shot looks more pure off the ball. He's really efficient at getting to the rim. There are questions on Namari Burnett's ability to drive well. And offensively, you could say that Lamar Washington has proven to be an efficient three-level scorer against the highest level of competition that he's going to face on the prep circuit. And Namari Burnett always had a little bit of questions when it came to just how much of the scoring was going to be able to translate because of the jump shot. At times looked like he struggled a lot to get it off of pull-ups. Don't have that same sort of issue with Lamar Washington. So Burnett's offensive game was interesting, but certainly in their roles in the high school level and certainly on the prep circuit, it's similar. Another guy, Kyler Edwards, someone that came in. I think that the games that they're going to end up playing are quite a bit different. I certainly think Lamar Washington's a lot more skilled at getting to the rim than Kyler was from day one coming into Tech. But I mean, looking at body types, I mean, Kyler weighed in today at 209 pounds and 6'4 3/4 at the or at the G League Combine. Lamar Washington is listed at 6'4", 210 pounds. Both of them kind of have a strong build plus wingspan. A lot of similarities from a body type. I think defensively the intensity is the same, but I really do think like Lamar Washington compares about as well as you're going to find from anyone when it comes to just what his body looks like, his readiness to play at the highest level of college basketball. Like there's some guys coming into Tech over the last few years where you've been wondering about how they're going to match up physically or how they're going to match up mentally. You don't really have that concern with Lamar Washington. Like he's a guy that's played against really high level prospects and has held his own. If anything, he's boosted his stock and looked better against those high level teams, which it's kind of rare, and it's a welcome sight for sure because it's nice to have someone where he's coming into Tech on a real upwards trajectory as opposed to maybe being downwards or at a minimum being stagnant.
I have an NBA comp that I feel like might get me slandered, but I feel pretty good about it. It is a last year shortened season Shea Gilgeous Alexander. And so I think the comparisons I see here is last year shortened season to SGA, really good athlete. Like I think that SGA is truly like a top tier athlete in the NBA. It just gets overshadowed because he's hurt so much, and uh, obviously the Thunder suck. But his athleticism really shows getting to the rim. I think that that's an area where Lamar Washington could shine as well. SGA had a good shooting year that year, especially off the dribble. I think that's where Lamar Washington will generate a lot of his offense. SGA created really well for teammates. He rebounded well, and then he played really good defense. Obviously, there's a little bit of a breakdown because SGA is a little bit longer, and that's really where I think his off-ball defense shine, but where that will be the difference in terms of off-ball defense. Lamar Washington has proven to be a really strong on-ball defender, and it's kind of crazy to me that we haven't even mentioned that yet because his offensive game is that good. Like it warrants us not talking about his defense until the 28-minute mark, but he is a guy that knows how to turn defense into offense, and I think that he is going to get a lot better on the defensive end once he starts playing for Mark Adams. And so that just gets me all the more excited, man. I think he's a true two-way player, and he just reminds me of SGA a little bit in his offensive game specifically.
Yeah, well, I guess we're just really into comparing the 2018 the 2018 NBA draft with the 2022 Texas Tech recruiting class. I mean, at this point, I'm expecting a Robert Jennings to Zach Smith comparison tomorrow. But talking about kind of the SGA comparison, I think it has a lot of legs. I mean, you look at the way SGA is able to get to the rim. I will say I think he's probably a little bit better as a natural athlete than what Lamar Washington has shown, at least relative to their age group and relative to who they're playing against. But certainly Lamar Washington is someone that has pretty good burst for his size and strength and utilizes drives a lot. I mean, SGA, I mean, people really seem to overlook just how often SGA attacks the rim and just how good he is at that. And I mean, that's another discussion for another day with other circles, but certainly, I mean, that's something that I think Lamar Washington's going to be able to bring. I mean, he's someone that has played a variety of different offensive styles, but probably looks his most comfortable when it comes to attacking the rim, finishing through contact, sort of being able to be an elite level driver. And then the jump shot, I think as a pull-up shooter, I was a little bit skeptical at first. I think it's still going to be something he's going to have to grow into a little bit, but certainly off the ball, I no longer have the doubts that I once did. I think that he's going to be able to be positive off ball shooter from day one. And I mentioned when we first did this podcast, when we first talked about Lamar Washington when he committed, we mentioned one of the comparisons I mentioned was Tyshawn Alexander. And I think that that's still a decent comp, but I mean, at this point, Lamar Washington the last few months has proven offensively that he has a much better game than Tyshawn Alexander did coming into Creighton, and certainly even a couple years into Creighton. Like his ability to score at all three levels and his fluidity, I think, is something that gives him a little bit of an advantage over Tyshawn. But I mean, certainly, I'm not going to make another comp just because I honestly have a little bit of trouble thinking of one as transparent as that is. Like I feel like his development has thrown things off in the sense that, like, if you look at him purely defensively, he has a lot of on-ball value. Like, you want to talk about tech comparisons, I could see there's a world where Lamar Washington's on-ball defense, if he put as much effort and his role as being an elite level on-ball defender, I think he could be a Clarence Nadolny type of just complete pest. Now, does he have the attitude for it and the other stuff that comes with Clarence? Don't really know, but you certainly have that sort of intensity on the ball and kind of aggressiveness. He's an aggressive defender. And off the ball, I think he's more than capable as a defender as well. Like you said, he doesn't quite have the wingspan of a SGA, but he certainly has the positive wingspan. Like it's not a weakness of his. It's just not an outlier, Talon Horton Tucker type of strength. And so just in general, like he's a guy that defensively is going to be a positive so long as he doesn't have mental lapses. And offensively, it's hard to completely translate it, but all of the signs look like he's going to be a really dangerous offensive player. And we mentioned yesterday with Pop Isaacs that if his game translated as well as we think it might, then he'd be a real ceiling raiser. But certainly with Lamar Washington, I mean, if his offense translates as well as we've seen the last few months at AZ Compass Prep and obviously with the Portland Generals in the Hoop Summit game, you're talking about a guy that's a draft prospect. Simple as that. Not only a draft prospect, but potentially a high draft prospect, and certainly one of the best prospects in the Big 12.
Really excited to watch him play at Texas Tech next year and work himself into the elite tier of college basketball players. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to our Lamar Washington freshman preview. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go like this video on YouTube and let us know how you think Lamar Washington is going to fare in the Big 12 next season. Until our next episode, you can follow us on our podcast feed wherever you get podcasts. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow Emery on Twitter at eraser41, and then follow the official Locked On Texas Tech Twitter page at LockedOnTTU to get notified whenever a new episode goes live. Until then, thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On Big 12. Get all of your Big 12 daily news in less than 30 minutes with Big 12 expert Josh Neighbors. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow.